Kia ora everyone. My name's Imi. My real name's Amrit, but I go by Imi. I am a student at the Institute for Applied Ecology. My primary supervisor is Professor Andrea Alfaro, and my secondary supervisor is Professor Simon Milne at the School of Hospitality and Tourism. So my PhD topic is on mangroves, and today I'm just going to talk a little bit about a literature review that I've just completed. So I'm 5 months into my PhD, so similar to Sarah. And this is going to be a comparison of tropical and temperate mangrove ecosystem services, because a lot's known about tropical mangroves. A lot of research has been done, whereas very little has been done about temperate ecosystem services, of which we have here in New Zealand. So my PhD study is actually a cross-disciplinary study, hence the School of Science and Hospitality and Tourism, because I'm looking at perceptions and attitudes of local communities in New Zealand towards mangroves, but how that actually influences management decisions and therefore affects ecology of areas that have been removed. And this is my current overview of tropical and temperate services, as I said, but with an emphasis on New Zealand. So mangroves, for anyone that doesn't know what mangroves are, they are intertidal forests. They generally occupy the range of 30 degrees north and south in the world, and the highest biodiversity of mangroves can be seen here. So this is mainly Southeast Asia, also the north coast of Australia. And we have between 41 to 47 species in some areas, and there are 70 mangrove species worldwide. They're limited by frost as a main limiting factor here, and as you can see, New Zealand actually has one of the most southerly mangroves in the world, along with Victoria in Australia. And here we only have one species, which I'll be speaking about later. So worldwide losses of mangrove forests. Between 1980 and the year 2000, 35% of the world's mangroves were lost. And then a further 192,000 hectares were lost between 2001 and 2012. The main reasons for losses are conversion to agricultural land, also urban and coastal development, which has happened all across the world, and because mangroves reside by the coastline, this is something that gets squeezed out very, very easily. And we also have conversion to aquaculture as a main driving force for removal of mangroves. Mainly happened in the 80s and 90s. There's actually quite a lot of mangrove restoration and conservation across the world now, especially in tropical regions. So this is a graph of mangrove losses over those 11-12 years. And as you can see here, it's dominated by Asia, losses in Asia. Now, as I said before, Asia does have the highest amount of mangrove area in the world, but it has also got the highest amount of loss. So that's really, really strong here. New Zealand's up on the right-hand side in the legend, but there's not actually any loss in New Zealand mangroves, and I'll be speaking about that a bit later. So on to ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the services provided by nature for the use of humans, essentially, and we've monetarized these services. There's a big field of environmental economics to tell us how much the environment is worth to us, which can be quite dangerous actually, because if you put a value on ecosystem services, and if you lose it, it puts a lot of pressure, and it might not be accurately reflecting what's going on with local communities and how they directly utilize environments. So for mangroves, we have 3 different kinds of ecosystem services. These are actually the 3 main services you have for any environmental area or ecosystem. We have provisioning services, cultural services, and regulating services. And underpinning these 3, we have supporting services. Supporting services are those such as soil formation, primary production, and nutrient retention. And without these supporting services, we won't actually have these other services here. So bring your attention to provisioning services. This will be something like mangroves being a nursery for fish species, and also a habitat for plant species and other animals. And we have a direct use for this as humans for commercial and recreational fishing and hunting. And also in the tropics, local communities harvest materials as well for timber, for fuel wood, for charcoal as well, which can be exported regionally, if not internationally. We also have cultural services, so recreation, ecotourism, for example in mangroves, it would be providing boardwalks to walk through, kayaking within mangroves, that kind of thing. And we also have existence or bequest values, and this is just the purely aesthetic nature of having a forest to walk through or an environment. So again, direct usage, but also a non-use value here. And finally, we have regulating services. Carbon sequestration. This is a really, really big ecosystem service for mangrove forests. They retain a huge amount of carbon, especially blue carbon or below ground carbon, which is a developing field of research at the moment. And that has a direct effect on reducing global warming because it captures carbon dioxide. We also have flood and water control, storm buffering, sediment retention, and nutrient retention as well. So as you can see, lots of uses for mangroves. This is a little figure for a chapter of ecosystem services that I've been lucky enough to work on with some other authors, which is going to be published soon. So it's talking about the range of ecosystem services that mangroves can have. So from the local here up to the global. And as you can see, carbon sequestration is a global service. We also have recreation ecotourism, which again can be a global service because people can travel all across the world to go to an area, do some kayaking, that kind of thing. And we have this feedback loop here for payments for ecosystem services, or PES. And this is the payment or incentives given to managers or landowners to protect their land for ecological services. So essentially this helps restoration and conservation of mangroves and can really benefit local communities as well. Studies so far. So across the world, a lot of studies have been done on ecosystem services of mangroves, and these are results from a meta-analysis that was done a couple of years ago based on 2 previous meta-analyses on the number of ecosystem services studies of mangroves. So as you can see, dominated by Asia here, and dominated by fisheries as an ecosystem service, followed by fuelwood, and then coastal protection. Pacific, where we are, very little amount of studies done here comparatively, but also a much smaller area of mangrove. And then following this by year, so 1980 to 1984, you can see that the 3 ecosystem services that were studied were just fisheries, fuelwood and timber, and tourism and recreation. And then following this, there were actually no studies at all. And nowadays we have a bit more of an equal division here of ecosystem services, still quite a small amount of biodiversity or existence services, and fisheries again still dominate. So biodiversity, so all the plant and animal life within an environment, is actually an incredibly important ecosystem service that we don't directly use, but it underpins all other services and the actual ecological functioning of ecosystems. Temperate mangroves now. So as I said, we do have temperate mangroves. They're not as diverse, and they're only in a few countries in the world. As you can see here, we have some in Kyushu, Japan, a couple in America, southern coast of Brazil, South Africa, 3 states in Australia, and then here in New Zealand. And New Zealand is just dominated by 1 species, which is Avicennia marina, with the subspecies Australasica. Now, the difference between temperate mangroves and tropical mangroves, apart from their lesser biodiversity, is also the fact that 5 of these countries are in the top GDP in the world, the top 50 GDP. They're not utilised by local communities in the same way. So in tropical mangroves, local communities will use them directly for subsistence living, potential for payment for ecosystem services, and also restoration and conservation. Whereas here, for example, we don't have any real direct use for mangroves, so our perceptions and attitudes might be more on the negative side compared to the positive values that are recognised for tropical mangroves. On to New Zealand. So New Zealand they have a lot of mangroves actually, and they're growing into the sea, as a lot of people know. They are an indigenous species, which some people might not know. So the first records of mangroves being present in New Zealand were 19 million years ago. And this current species has been here for 11,000 years. And you can see that they are limited, so they're limited by frost. So they go as far north, right up to Cape Reinga, but then down here, Ohio Harbour on the east coast and Kawhia Harbour on the west coast, along the same line of latitude here. And there's a big disparity in opinion of mangroves in New Zealand, which I'll speak about in a minute. My study, my PhD study, which I've only touched upon here because I really just wanted to give you a background, is related to mangrove ecosystem services. MES here, a bit of an acronym, and in a sense it is a bit of a mess in New Zealand. So mangrove corresponds to management as well. So there's been a variety of management practices in New Zealand with the removal of mangroves. Consents have been granted kind of quite readily recently for removing them. There have been a lot of illegal removals as well. And there's not a huge amount of protection of mangroves in New Zealand. The E is for ecosystem, and it's also for ecology. So how the ecology, including biodiversity, food webs, and subsequent degradation of mangrove habitat through removal methods also really affects the ecosystem services. And then finally, services, so society, how we perceive mangroves, what our relationships are with estuarine ecosystem, again affects the management and the ecology of the area. So this essentially is my PhD study in a Venn diagram. Okay, so New Zealand studies so far, there haven't been many studies on New Zealand ecosystem services. There's been actually one main study that has tried to assess the value of land-based ecosystems in New Zealand. And if you have a look here, these two authors valued all of the land-based habitats, and they've actually put mangroves right at the end here as having the least value, with agriculture having the most here. But I don't really think that was an accurate representation because it doesn't take into account the area of each of these systems. So if you recalibrate the graph per hectare and value of dollars, you can actually see that mangroves are in 5th place now. They have moved up. And wetlands are in 1st place here. And I would argue that mangroves are actually coastal wetlands, so they should really be further up the chain here. And the authors do recognise that the mangroves have been severely underestimated in their study. Okay, so there's been one study on the perceptions of local communities that's come out last year in Whangapoa Harbour, and it spoke to the local community. The council members there spoke to the local community and wanted to see what people wanted for their harbour, what kind of things that they found important. People wanted a decrease in the spread of mangroves or mangroves removed. This is a negative point for mangroves. But they also wanted enhanced biodiversity, better public awareness, and to re-establish wetland areas as the kidneys of the estuary and as sediment traps. Now, they didn't recognise mangroves as having any of these properties or functions, which is quite interesting because that's exactly what they do. So it's actually a positive for mangroves as well. And it has been recognised that they are a habitat for fish species and bird species as well, and they can mitigate coastal erosion and flooding. So again, we've got a nice positive for mangroves. But the expansion that is happening at quite a rapid rate from sedimentation will reduce habitat for benthic communities. So whilst it increases the habitat for some species, it will reduce habitats for others. So we have a positive and a negative there. And it is recognised that mangroves are a valued natural habitat, providing benefit for erosion, fish habitat, kayaking amongst mangroves as well. So we do have a positive. And this just highlights the differences in opinion that people have about the value of mangroves, which is what I'll be investigating in more detail for my PhD. And this was a nice little radio excerpt by Veronica Medana based on Motumanoa, Pollen Island, on mangroves there, talking about the ecosystem services. Unfortunately, it doesn't play, but I encourage you to look it up. It's on Radio New Zealand. It's called An Ode to Mangroves. It's really interesting. And breaking news from last week, actually, was that Auckland Council's agreed for a more restrictive approach now to removal of mangroves because they have been taken down at quite a rapid rate recently. And Auckland Council also believe that the shrub does have an ecological value, which is great, so I'll be investigating that. Some of you are laughing there because that's what you're studying too, so yeah. Watch this space. So here are my references, and thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you very much. And do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Can you suggest a nice mangrove around Auckland for me to go kayaking?
Yeah, I mean, I've not really explored them around here, but I think further up north they have the more beautiful, taller mangroves, so maybe up Whangarei and Bay of Islands, I would say. Yeah, I'd love to go up there and see them as well. Yes.
Do you have any evidence of cultural, historical uses, especially from the Māori?
Yes, so I have, there's a little bit of evidence previously, anecdotal historical evidence, but no current evidence in the literature about how they're utilised, which is why I'm also going to be talking to kaitiaki, so guardians of the environment, to see what level of utilisation there actually is towards mangroves, perhaps for fishing. I'm thinking fishing could be one of the main things. But previously, yes, so in Crisp et al. Wrote about it in about the 1980s, and previously they were still recognised as really important grounds for seafood for Kaimana. So I hope to find some value there for mangroves still to this day.
Thank you for your question. Yes, please.
Do you think that it's poor information on mangroves? It's because previously we don't have them so many spreading around New Zealand, and nowadays it's like everywhere?
Yeah, I think so. And it was interesting because I was reading last night about how mangroves should be protected in New Zealand in this book that came out in the 80s and 90s, and actually there was real advocacy for protection. But since then, because of the expansion, people have kind of changed their minds and people want to cut them down, but we don't know what value we're actually removing and what ecological function we're removing. But because New Zealand really focuses on recreational and amenity value for estuaries and things like that, people think that they're choking the estuaries and really kind of being detrimental to their estuarine environment. So it's generally perceived that they are quite negative because of their growth. So I think it needs to be controlled.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Any more questions to Amy? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.